Thanks so much, Courtney. What a great session. I am now joined by Mike Smitheman, who's the VP of Sales and Marketing for Metric Insights, who is dialing in today to chat to me all about business intelligence governance. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks, Catherine. Good to chat with you.
It's amazing to have you joining us on the festival today and talking about such an interesting topic. I mean, for the benefit of everyone, including myself, should we start out by defining exactly what is business intelligence governance?
Yeah, of course. So in our experience, organizations have put a lot of focus on the term data governance. And I think the way they think about that is kind of a very bottom-up approach, whereby they're looking at sort of the individual tables and columns that they might have in their databases and making sure that data is defined correctly, that it's accurate, that there's a level of checks and balances against it, and ultimately, trying to put processes and procedures in place to ensure that it's used correctly. And I guess I'd argue that that's just one side of the equation. That most people in organizations are not consuming raw data. We as in sort of BI teams create very sophisticated analytics and reports and dashboards on top of that data. And we're doing that in different BI tools and reporting applications. And as important as it is to govern the data, you also need a level of governance around the BI and analytics as well, because at the end of the day, what's the point of governing data if the report that you're pushing out there has issues, or it's visualizing the data in the wrong way, or the calculations are in there incorrectly, or the user thinks it's telling them one thing and it's telling them something else. So, governance, I think you have to think about it as sort of marrying both the data governance aspects and the BI governance aspects themselves, so that you can generate this level of trust in the BI that's going out there.
Absolutely. I mean, many of the conversations that I'm a part of, data governance is very much front of mind, as you say, making sure that data set is correct to then be filtered into these reports. But actually, it's really interesting, as you say, the importance of making sure those reports and visualizations, as you say, are then being correct as well. It's constant governance. So why do you think this is so necessary to be talking about right now? What was kind of the spark for this conversation today for you, Mike?
Yeah, so I think when we think about governance, typically we naturally sort of move towards the concept of security and permissions, and that whole aspect around data security, and obviously that is important. But I think why governance is coming to the forefront more and more is that, for anyone working in this industry for any period of time, it's kind of not news to us that BI has suffered a little bit with what I would call engagement with BI. So people actually using reports and dashboards within the business. And the reality is, most users in an organization do not want to be data analysts. The reality is they have a job to do. And whilst data can support that job, they're not sitting there slicing and dicing in dashboards every day, right? They have a job to get on with, but data could absolutely help them, right? So as well as thinking of governance as a way of securing information, we should also think of governance as a way of driving engagement with BI and analytics. And why is that important more today? Well, I think we've all experienced the last sort of 12, 18 months. Companies are putting more and more focus on cost and ROI. And I think historically, ROI for BI has been more measuring around, the content that we're producing. How many reports and dashboards have we produced on our platforms? And are we getting the right value out of them from that perspective? Versus, can we use governance to drive engagement with the actual content and get some actual business value out of it and justify our ROI and BI programs from that perspective? So I would argue sort of a good governance program is necessary because it will drive better engagement. And inherently, I think we all know now that if we've got better data and people are using it and they can trust it, we're probably going to drive the business forward in a better way.
Absolutely. Now, I want to pull on that thread a little, as you mentioned there, Mike, about the engagement. What's been the experience that you've had within your organization, but your customers as well? What's driving this disengagement? Is it just the over-reporting? Is it that some reports are inaccurate, so therefore I'm not going to trust any report that the team gives me? What's the experiences that you've been seeing which has really fueled the flames of this disengagement?
Yeah, I think the problem is BI has almost become a victim of its own success, right? Data is not shrinking, right? We're getting more and more data, and the hunger for data is getting more and more because we know it can help us. But also the technology in the BI space is advancing as well. So there's lots of new technologies and approaches, and it's all come to this head where companies have given up on this concept of trying to standardize on one BI tool, right? People are investing in the right technology for the right job, which often lands with, sort of environments where there are multiple tools and multiple reporting applications. You've then got reporting in every application you invest in. So there's reports in your CRM platform, in your support and ticketing system. Everywhere you look, there's reports. And there's this hunger to create more and better reports, and you end up with these environments that are just bloated with useful content alongside obsolete content, alongside duplicative content. And I think business users just get frustrated. It's hard to find what I should trust, what I should be using. There's 4 versions of the same report out there, and honestly, it's easier for me to pick up the phone to the BI team and say, hey, answer this question for me, than try and hunt for a report and find the context and understand whether it's something I should be using or not. So it is not unusual for us to go into a company and look at what they're doing and see that over half the content on any platform has never been used in the last 60 days, or that we're paying for X 100,000 licenses on a particular platform. Half of those have not been used in the last 90 days.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, it's so ironic what you say there about users knocking on the door of BI teams, because that's the entire point of having dashboards and self-serve, is that they can do that so that there's not a huge queue outside of the BI teams, whether that's virtually or in person, depending where you are in the world at the moment. That's exactly the idea of behind the reporting, is that you have those data and decisions that you can then make based on that without having to have that necessarily person contact as well. It's such an irony.
Exactly, and you make a good point about this concept of self-service, right? We're great, like any industry, at throwing sort of terms around, right? And not really having solid definitions for what we really mean by those sort of things. And I think every BI vendor out there today is talking about self-service, and I think there's this incorrect perception that self-service should just be about people being able to create their own analytics, right? This idea that everyone is going to be a business analyst within the organization and create their own reports as they need them. Never going to happen for a lot of the users out there. So I think you're right in terms of we should also be thinking about self-service simply as being able to find the content that is out there that's already created, that I can trust, that has been categorized and certified in a way that I know, if I'm in sales, but I want to look at a customer support dashboard, I should be able to find it and know what it is and that I can trust it.
Absolutely. Now, I want to pivot the conversation slightly and talk about the challenges behind having a BI governance strategy. I mean, I've been part of some brilliant conversations recently around this, and the fact that, as you say, victim of your own success is definitely what we've seen here, especially with COVID as well. Suddenly it was, I need reporting hourly in some cases for some industries, because things were moving so rapidly to the point where you've got all of these reports coming everywhere. So now let's zero in on the kind of strategic challenges going forward for now. What are you hearing from your customers?
Yeah, so I would highlight two key areas, I think. One is, like any sort of program, it's about process, but you also need the technology to back it up, right? So if you think of that environment that we've just been talking about, where reporting exists everywhere in every piece of technology, and there's multiple BI tools, some of which may have some governance capabilities, right? Some of which may have some of those checks and balances, but not all, and some might not. Having being able to implement a program with a technology that has a consistent layer across all your reporting and BI is sort of critical to being able to successfully implement the governance programs that you want. So, again, it shouldn't all be about technology, but you do need the technology to implement and measure the process. So I would say that's one of the challenges is, how do you take this heterogeneous environment and layer on something that will help you with it? And then the other thing I'd say is I think a lot of people are suddenly finding, they need to do governance, but suddenly governance can actually be a barrier to driving engagement, because you shouldn't just govern for governance sake, right? There should be enough governance to keep things secure and correct and categorized, but it shouldn't block usage or innovation, which it very easily could, right? If you insist that all the data is scrutinized to the lowest level for every report and that it goes through a 10-stage process before it gets certified, you're going to struggle to, why am I even going to bother, right? It's never going to get through the process and get looked at. So it's balancing this concept of yes, having governance, but not using that as a blocker to getting content out there that's useful to people. I think that's something people need to think about, and a challenge they need to think about is being able to categorize content that they want to create in an appropriate way with the level of scrutiny and governance on it, so that, again, users can get access to that. And one of the biggest mistakes I see is that people put too much focus on access and permissions and security to the detriment of making content available. Obviously, you should secure your sensitive data, but everything else you kind of want out there. You want people to be able to find it easily, even if they don't have access to it right away. If I am in sales, I have a question about customer support, and I can see that report exists, I should be able to find it and request access to it and not have someone recreate it just because, I don't have access to the one that's out there already.
Absolutely. That balancing act, as you mentioned, is so important. And then, as you say, you don't want governance to be the department of no or the area of no either. You want it to be an enablement. You want it to be a driver of innovation, and you want it to run alongside everything that you want to do with the organization. You don't want to end up having to go back and think, oh, have we considered governance? And you don't want to, as you say, be thinking, I'm not going to do this. I'm never going to get the buy-in from the governance team to do all this because it's got to go through so much. What's the point? We certainly do not want that in our organizations, for certain.
Exactly. Yeah.
So when I knew we were going to be talking today, Mike, I wanted to pick your brains on content certification, as it seems like a pretty key concept when we're talking about all of this. So how can organizations go about implementing a certification there?
Yeah, so I think, from a BI governance perspective, certification is typically like the last step, right? So if you think, I've created a report, it has to go through a process of governance. And that's typically, checking the data is correct, adding the necessary metadata and categorization around it, checking the calculations are correct and the visualizations are accurate. And the last stage is typically some sort of stamp of approval to say, yeah, this is something that's going to go out there. People can see it's certified and that it's accurate and that they can trust it. That's ultimately what we're trying to do here. Now, the challenge becomes setting up a certification process that is a one-size-fits-all, because that never happens, right? So when people think about those processes and those workflows and that certification, they need to think about it in terms of the content that they're producing, and it is not a one-size-fits-all. And so what you need to do is classify your content. And that's really, I think, from two perspectives, is, how broadly is this content going to be used? How big is the audience that is going to be looking at it? And ultimately, how sort of mission critical is it to the organization? So let me give you an example. So I'm in the IT department. I create a network performance report that looks at last month's performance across all our systems. It's not being used mission critically. We have our alerting systems if something goes down, but it gives us an indication of how we're performing. I'm going to share it with my 3 team members, and we're going to look at it every month. That is not something that needs to go through a big long process where everyone's checking it. There's 10 stages and it gets a stamp of approval. I'm probably going to have a process where I create it and I certify it and I share it with the team, and maybe we revisit it in 12 months and check it's still relevant. Right, that's one potential certification flow. On the other end of the scale, if I've been tasked in the BI team as creating a report with our CFO and our finance department, it's our monthly results, it's going to go out to the board and our investors and the management team. If we get it wrong, we're in trouble. That needs some effort, right? It's going to go to a data steward who's going to look at the data and check the metrics and numbers are correct. It's going to go to the business owners to make sure they sign off on it, and the finance team. I'm going to double check what I've created and make sure it's accurate. And every month, we're probably going to go through that process as the data updates. That requires a different sort of process. So certification is key to sort of get it out there and make sure people know they can trust it, but it needs to have the correct workflow behind it. And that's why we say sort of one size does not fit all for those processes.
There we go. So anyone writing notes during this session, Mike, will be saying one size does not fit all in block capitals there. Absolutely fantastic. Now, the last question I wanted to pose to you today whilst I've got you is, it's very true that if you care about it, you're going to measure it. So how do you measure the success of governance initiatives and strategies?
Yeah, so I would look at it from 2 perspectives again, and we've been talking about one of those, and that is purely engagement with BI, right? Because I think ultimately, if we can increase that as an industry, companies will see better ROI on their efforts. So one thing you should be measuring is for this library of content that you're governing and keeping for users, are they actually using it over time? What is their journey with that content? Do they look at it once? Do they look at it every week? Who's looking at it? Where's it being used? Has it run its life cycle and we should be retiring it? Is it new and we should be promoting it, right? If we can understand that usage across the board, wherever it might be being used, is it in the BI tool? Is it because someone's getting it in their email? Is it because they're looking at it on their mobile device? We need all those touch points. We need the technology to measure that as well, so that we can drive engagement up, and ultimately I think that's a measurement of a good governance process. But secondly, governance is something that's, let's face it, it's kind of a pain to do, but it's necessary. So as much as you can put onus on measuring the governance process and using that to sort of drive enthusiasm with it. So, Catherine, you're an analyst, you're pushing out reports to the team, you've been tasked with governing them. Well, let's show you how many of your reports are certified versus not. How much effort have you put into categorizing it? And how does that tie to how those users are actually engaging with your content? And I guarantee there'll be a correlation there, and you get some enthusiasm over the fact that actually what you're creating is being used and is useful out in the business. So those two, marrying them together, I think is a great starting point for saying, this is a worthwhile exercise that we should be doing.
100%. I mean, I'm in total agreement. And you want to be producing things that the company and business are using, and they're coming back to you and having that conversation as well, saying, this is really great. I've enjoyed this aspect to it because it's enabled me to do X, Y, and Z, that continuous discussion as well. And it just breeds that innovation. And I love the point, especially as you say, about where are they accessing it? Is it on the mobile phone? Because it could be as simple as that. Oh yeah, when I'm commuting, if you are commuting, that is when I check these reports, so I know when I walk in the office, my first question is going to be to this person about this certain product that we're using. It's so interesting. Mike, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for your time.
Now I am going to pass you back to Courtney, who is sat down with our next guest, ready to keep this amazing conversation going. Back to you, Courtney.